Today's focus of today's webinar is going to be Diagram It, which is the name of the series. We're focusing on specifically representing single sign-on. So today's focus is going to be about how do we represent that? What are a couple different ways to represent that on a diagram? And then ultimately, what are the trade-offs between those different approaches? Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So again, visual representation is the first thing we're going to work on. So we're going to look at a couple just static diagrams of what does non-SSO versus what does typical SSO look like from a popular provider. I think the one we're going to look at today is actually from Okta. Got it directly from their support site. And then we're going to walk through, what does that look like inside of IriusRisk? What could it look like? What are some trade-offs using different styles for diagrams? And that'll conclude today's webinar. So, all right, let's get into it. So when we talk about visual representation, okay, the questions that I always like to kind of consider and like to go through in this process are, number one, is it a meaningful item to include on my diagram, right? So not everything is going to have equal value all the time, so does it impact the scope for this model? And I say scope because when we think about the way IriusRisk is configured and the way that it works, a lot of times if I place something on my diagram, so specifically like if I place an entire set of components related to SSO, it's going to impact the overall risk of that threat model. But that may not be something that I'm threat modeling in the scope for this version, or maybe not even in this threat model at all. Maybe I'm just adding an ability for someone to manage their own password, through a password reset to a form or to the front end of a web UI, right? That doesn't necessarily need to be, do I need to threat model SSO every single time I do that? Probably not. Number two, security impacting. Does this representation impact the security of my diagram? So am I spending time on something that really, doesn't impact security, isn't going to have any relevance, overall for my threat model? So something to consider. Number three, does it maximize my return? We did have a webinar a couple days ago, actually, about talking about diminished marginal returns when threat modeling something. The value you get out of representing a system on a diagram in the first 60, 90, 120 minutes, 2 hours starts to get diminished as I continue to spend more and more time on that. So once I've drawn that representation of SSO, I probably don't need to redraw that in every single threat model I do. Maybe there's a more effective way to get a higher return on that by representing that with a different component or with a different, type of object. Okay. And then lastly, what are expectations? Sometimes we do things just because, that's what our boss expects of us, or that's what we know an auditor is going to expect to see. Obviously, sometimes the best diagram is a diagram that is both clear, represents a good scope, and then, three, doesn't require any additional questions from an auditor or from an executive stakeholder or something like that, right? So it's able to be analyzed, it's got high skim value, but it's not going to generate a lot of negative questions or, hey, why don't you have this? Why is this here? So get a good understanding of what those expectations are. And we'll review these on an ongoing basis as we talk about representation of different concepts in our threat models. So on to the next one here. So again, this is kind of our non-SSO scenario, right? So we have some user browsing to some domain, and this could be a SaaS application, could be something. That user is then going to have to log in. It's going to ask for credentials. It's going to store that cookie. And then essentially he's now authenticated with that site. And then, process repeats itself with every single domain. Now, we're not going to diagram a non-SSO example today, but this is going to be the compare and contrast between this particular non-SSO example and the one we are going to diagram, which is the typical SSO process, right? So the user is going to browse to some domain. That domain is then going to reach out to whatever that authentication server is. So that could be, Okta, Azure, Ping, something like that. And then it's going to essentially say, hey, is this a valid user? Is he allowed to access this resource? And then if so, he's going to issue a token to that individual. That token is stored locally. And then they're able to then provide that token to whatever that domain resource is, whether that's a server, whether that's a SaaS application. And then now they've been authenticated. Okay. And then, again, moving over to domain two, I have this exact same process where, again, and I may even be able to use that exact same token for that other resource, depending on how it's configured. but I have this process where now I can access multiple levels and multiple parts of the organization using that same authentication process, right? Now, how does that translate into a diagram? And I'm just going to pause the share for a second and swap over to IriusRisk. So how does that change into a representation within IriusRisk? Now, depending on the scope of my diagram, that's going to change how much context I need to provide inside of that diagram. Back into our SSO project. So let's go ahead and open that up, and let's look through just a couple of different examples here. So I've diagrammed these side by side just so we can see the different examples, and just kind of pass through these as we go. So if anyone can't see this, just let me know here in the chat, and I will get that spaced out a little bit further for you guys. So so in our first example, right, and I'm just going to zoom out just a little bit so you're able to see, both our questions, right? So does it impact scope? Is it security impacting? Does it maximize return? And then what are expectations? So we wind up with, this example here, right? I've got my unauthenticated user, and you can see this has kind of a data flow representation to it. So similar to what we did earlier on our data flow diagram, right? Where I'm, obviously this isn't exactly an architectural representation, but I have kind of an overview of how this user is interacting with it. I've incorporated aspects of that into my diagram to kind of show, I have a logical flow in my diagram, right? So from 1 to 2 to 3, and I'm representing that on a base layer. You could also use multiple layers for this on the diagram if you wanted to. That's perfectly fine. But I've got an unauthenticated user talking to a web client, and he's requesting authentication to, some final resource, right? So I've got the process of reaching out to my authentication server. He's logging in, credential request, credential response. Whether or not he's been authenticated, I have a yes/no logging process. Token success request, token's been granted, handed off back to that web client, and now I have an authenticated user who's able to provide that token in exchange for access to some resource, right? Very high level. Obviously, there are going to be details missing here, right? But the key things here is that, number one, we've got a pretty functional representation of SSO, right? It is using a mixture of, data flow diagram, architectural style, different diagramming techniques. We are leveraging data flows to show, which direction items are using. We're also using data flow tags, which are added inside of here within our data flow details. You can see I've just added that authentication request in here. I've added that so that I can see what's happening on that data flow. And like some of these data flows, these aren't things you would normally see on data flows, but that's perfectly okay. Because I've got some kind of, what kind of response is it, whether or not it's being logged. I can then add additional rules using our data flow engine, and our rules engine and our data flow library, that what happens when this type of response happens, what happens anytime I see some kind of authentication process, right? I'm able to track these items using that data flow library, using these tags, so that I've got this representation. Now, what are the good things about this? I've got a very clear representation of activity. I mean, you can look at this, and even if you said, if I handed someone a diagram, they could look at this and go, okay, I think I have an authentication process going on here. Maybe I want to improve on, one section here, but I can see the scope of this is absolutely SSO, right? I'm not spending any time talking about what is this resource, right? I don't have any representation of this is a database component. I don't have any representation of, what is the overall, function here that we're expecting to see. But I can very clearly see, the scope of this is SSO. Now, moving on, like what are the negatives of that though? So obviously it's kind of busy. I've got a lot of moving parts in here, so you can imagine what would this look like if I had all of this in every single diagram that I work with, right? And that's kind of where we get into that duplication of efforts, because in reality, you probably only have one single sign-on identity provider that you're working with, maybe two, different environments, but for the most part, once I've threat modeled that once, I probably don't need to threat model it every single time an application is going to use that particular service. And that's where in the next view, we're going to start to see a more consolidated view. Sorry, just looking at some of the questions here. We're going to see a more consolidated view in the next section. So How to document if it's OIDC or SAML protocol in use. Yeah, so I think if I were going to do a SAML protocol in place, I would probably start adding labels to these different items. Because as you know, we have the ability to add. So if I want to, I can go in here and I can add tags if I want. So if I wanted to see which particular items are related to SAML, I could also add SAML response and SAML data flows in here. So if I wanted to see, like, for example, if I had a service provider, identity provider, I could start to add labels that are more aligned with, SAML versus, OpenID or something like that. Okay. So moving on to the slightly less detailed version here, scoot this down. So in this example, I'm using more functional components. So I still have the concept of unauthenticated user. He's accessing via web client, and I've got 3 functions here, right? He's got a login, he's got to change password, he's got to reset password, and both of those are interacting with AWS SSO. Okay. And then once I have access here, I'm now going to have access to some set of resources. And that could be some API, that could be this RDS database here, right? But obviously the focus now has changed. SSO is still here. It's still a part of my diagram, but it's no longer the central focal point of that diagram. So I have a mixture of DFD and architectural diagrams, but I'm also using more functional parts, right? And this is where we kind of go back to that first question of, does it impact scope? What is the most important thing in this diagram? At this point, it kind of seems like we're focusing more on how is that user interacting with that SSO process, and how is he interacting with the information between that different item, right? So I've got these different components in here that can be used, and these are all just found in our functional library over here on the left-hand side. Okay. So Pro, we have a clear understanding of activity. I'm still able to see, quite clearly what this user is doing. It's very concise. I have a lot less clutter in here, which allows me to have more room to describe what's going on in my data flows. Clearly SSO is in scope, but it's not the main focus of this threat model, right? So the main focus here is going to be, what are my functional components? And then I'm starting to develop a little bit more around what are the resources I'm accessing afterwards, but the focus here is going to be more on, delta integration risk, right? So, and when we say delta integration risk, what I'm thinking about from an integration standpoint is if I have a user who is, if I'm making some additional change to my SSO, right? The SSO threat model may not necessarily change, but I want to change anything else that might integrate with that on an additional level. So imagine I've got, some existing SSO process, and when I'm adding an authorized application to access that SSO, there's an additional set of risks that's brought in because of that configuration, right? So when I talk about delta integration risk, that's what I'm talking about, is if I've got some additional application that is accessing that particular service or that particular SSO, I'm looking for just the delta, just the net additional items in a diagram like this. It looks like we've got a couple questions here. Did you create a custom generic SSO, as I don't find it in the components library? Are we talking about, and I'm not sure shooting when that question came in. Yeah, this generic SSO. Yeah, this is one that I created, right? And that's one of the nice things about, so for example, the concept of an empty component. If I want to group a set of functions together, I have the ability to minimize those down so that I can see my entire SSO SAML function, and then I can auto expand that to see what's inside of that. And the way you can do that is by just grabbing a component here, and I could say, yeah, I said generic SSO. So, we could say Okta services, right? And then now I can pull that over and I can start to add items inside of that container. And then as I add to it, it'll give me the ability to collapse it down. But you can use those generic empty components like that, which don't convey any risk, as a method of categorizing and structuring items inside of here. Where is the unauthenticated user? The unauthenticated user is one that I added. So that's just a custom component that I've built, right? So the difference between unauthenticated user an authenticated user, the focus there is to show a before and after state. So I have an unauthenticated user, which could be, really just any generic threat actor, right? It doesn't have to be any assumption that he's actually a genuine user who means you no harm, right? But he's interacting with that web client. And then I think the last question is, I see the AWS component, but can it import firewall rules from a standard non-cloud firewall? Okay. So that's maybe a little bit out of scope for today's conversation, but I see the AWS component, can it import firewall rules from a standard non-cloud firewall? So I think what that question is asking is the ability to maybe customize some of the content that's attached to certain components. So absolutely, if you've got a default component in there, so like for example, I've got this AWS SSO, okay? You have the ability to edit a lot of the controls and countermeasures attached to AWS SSO as a component out of the box. So you can go in and I can say, maybe 10% of those controls have already been implemented. And because they've been implemented, I want to have those automatically marked as implemented anytime they come up. So what I could do is go into the rules engine and say, if component is AWS SSO, and maybe it's inside of our particular AWS tenant, then I want to automatically grab these 15 countermeasures and mark those as implemented. Now, to the same degree, you can also do the same thing with additional threats and additional risks for that given component. So if you're unhappy with the content that you see, you can go through and you can add that content using the rules engine. So the exact same function, you could say, if component is AWS SSO or AWS firewall, I want to add these additional risks from my library. Okay. So you can do either or. And if that's something you guys are more interested in, you guys are welcome to toss some comments in the webinar chat. We could probably do a session that is just around how to tailor and how to update the content in that manner. I know that's not germane to today's conversation, but we can certainly talk about that in the future in a future webinar. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to this next section. So on this one, right, so we even have, and I'm calling this the even less detailed view of SSO, right? I've got my web client, I've got my SSO project component, and then I've got, a much more detailed version of what they're asking, right? Some resources here, and I've renamed this just to have a nice category. Same thing I did over here with the generic SSO. I'm just renaming it over here on this side, so we have some collection of resources. Now, if you guys will remember, project components, this is its own threat model located in my tenant. So I've already threat modeled SSO in my organization and in my tenant and has its own threat model already. Okay. But I'm representing it here as its own threat model so that I've got some web client talking to my SSO. And then now once approved, that SSO is successfully authenticating and providing access to some set of resources in AWS, right? Just very generic for today's example. But in this example, some other team is responsible for that. It's already being threat modeled. I'm not going to rehash it in this diagram and inside this threat model because it's clearly not the main focus point, right? It's not the main focal point. It's not in scope for this given threat model. So, again, SSO is completely minimized. It's still included, but it's not going to carry over any threats by design. Because the thinking is with a project component is I've got a project that already has threat modeled that. But I want to be able to reference that project and reference the status and the outcomes of that project in other threat models. Because much like, the concept of, no system's an island, no system really exists in isolation, everything is kind of interconnected regardless of where it's at. That's what this, project component concept really has, because now I've got a way to represent the interconnectivity between not only systems, but also threat models. So my web client is talking to my SSO. That SSO has already been threat modeled somewhere else, but I don't want to rehash it. But I'm including that as a placeholder. And then now I can show that handoff between web client to SSO and then some set of resources. Okay, so what are the pros? So number one, we have reduced scope even further for SSO. And that allows us to focus on other items, right? Because I still have my threats from my web client being brought in, but I'm minimizing the threats for my SSO because those are now included on that separate threat model. And then clearly, right, my focal point is going to be this set of resources in AWS, the virtual cloud, the EC2 instance, the RDS database, and then ultimately, the API endpoint that I had previously. Okay. Now the cons, right? And this goes back to, remember our questions, right? Expectations. This might generate additional questions from auditors, outside stakeholders. Now, and again, that's where you have to define, what are expectations? What does a good threat model look like? Are we going to permit the use of project components? They do allow for a lot of time savings. It does prevent duplication of work between different threat models. So I'm not gonna, send someone tickets for through the issue tracker that are related to SSO. Well, hey, I've already got those tickets over here. I'm already working on that. Why are you sending me more, right? Because the goal is not tons and tons of noise. It's about sending downstream that which is prioritized, that which is actionable countermeasures, right? Okay. And I think we've got a couple more questions here that have come in. So is it possible to describe diagrams in some sort of code markup? Yes. So IriusRisk does have the open threat model format, which would basically allow you to have a threat model as code. And you can create diagrams from that format either through several endpoints. So we've got the ability to ingest Terraform, the ability to ingest Terraform Plan, CloudFormation, Visio, Dorado.io, and several other formats. Microsoft Threat Modeler, I think I saw that was one of the questions on here. Does IriusRisk support importing threat models made using Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool, JAMA? We do support Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool. I don't think we have direct support for JAMA at the moment, but we do have the ability to integrate with third parties like that through the through the API. And I believe we have full functionality there today to do that. So that's something we can maybe investigate a little bit further. And then we have, can you link this SSO reference point to the already threat model diagram? I think that might have been asked before we talked about the concept of this project component, but that's effectively what this is, right? So this project component is a direct link. So I can actually go to that source project. And the nice thing about the source project here is that it's still based on permission. So even though I can see that project component, if I don't have access to the SSO project, I can see the component, but I still can't go to the project. So it still maintains that least privilege on that project. Even though I can diagram with it, I can't navigate to it. So it still kind of keeps that segmentation between two different areas. And then lastly, how can I apply FedRAMP or other compliance requirements on this design? Yeah, so that's a good question. I was kind of thinking about that. I saw that come in. As I'm thinking about that, I think there's kind of two aspects here. So how can I apply FedRAMP to it, or how can I apply compliance requirements? So for example, we have I can't remember if I have a FedRAMP environment on here. I do, yeah. So what I could do is I could say that I have a certain part of my environment that needs to be in scope for FedRAMP, and I can demonstrate that in this manner. So if I wanted to show that I've got, this needs to be FedRAMP compliant, I can place those items inside of my FedRAMP component to show that I have a, out of scope for FedRAMP, in scope for FedRAMP, and then I'm able to show which items are in here. And then what you're going to see with this component is you're going to see controls and requirements specifically related to FedRAMP once I go into the threats interface. And I'll click over that and just kind of show you what that looks like. So you'll see some components in here related to that. And if I click on that, I may have, clicked the wrong one, sorry. Complete questionnaire. Yeah, so it's got my assets that I can store on there. But you'll have the ability to navigate to that specific component and see any threats or requirements that are generated by that inside of the threats interface. Okay. And you can also do that. I believe we've also got those for, I think it's cardholder data environment. Yeah, cardholder data environment. And then we've also got one for HIPAA environments. Also got one for GDPR. And those are inside of these different items down here, inside of the environments. Excuse me. Inside of the regulatory environments down here as well. So we've got several different items: POI device, cardholder data environment, HIPAA, FedRAMP, GDPR. And then ultimately, right, I think there's also the potential too, where especially the organization that's using like NIST 53, if you break your environment up into high, low, medium, different risk zones based on the type of assets and the type of systems that it supports, you could use those empty components that we saw before to break these into different segments. So I could use this component to break something into a low risk area, if I wanted to. Again, it really depends on how you want to represent this particular item. I could even break this into, it's a SaaS application, so maybe I'm not controlling 100% of the security of that area, and I can add that to my zone. Let's send that backwards. Bring that forward. Bring that up a little bit. Okay. And I think we've got time for one more question. So, is it possible to add assumptions, requirements to project components? So, for example, if SSO is already threat modeled by another team and they consider it secure, but only if certain requirements are met, requests include certain parameters, is it possible to flag just these requirements in the threat model where SSO is included as a project component? Yeah, that's a great question. So this is still a full component, right? So if I wanted to, I could actually go into the rules engine and say, if component is SSO project, I could then have those items and those threats be brought in that are just, what they consider those. What was the example you said? Requests include certain parameters, these requirements. Yeah, I could have all of those requirements or all of those secure parameters brought into the threat model anytime it's used. Wouldn't the risk level be represented by a trust zone? Yeah, so the trust zones are going to give me my attack surface, and they're certainly a part of that risk calculation. So for example, you see I'm using public cloud across the board here. If I were to replicate this in an internet trust zone, the threats related that are inside of the internet trust zone would be a higher priority than the ones inside of the public cloud zone, right? And that's just because I've got a greater attack surface. It's assuming that it's a less secure, less trusted zone, so it's going to prioritize one over the other. And I think we got one more question here. Any template we have for Azure Entry ID and its component for threat model, like app registration, PIM, user group role, conditional access? How can I have include IAM design? So we do have some Azure identity items represented inside of our Azure library. I would have to dig in and see exactly if we cover some of those items. I know I've definitely seen, I think that's privileged identity management. I've definitely seen user group role management. I've definitely seen conditional access in there. And a lot of those are probably going to be covered under Azure Active Directory. Yeah, so there's the component for Microsoft Entra ID, any template we have for Azure Entra ID. So either you could use this component, which is kind of what we see, here closer on representation number 2, or if you wanted to kind of blow this up and expand into it, you could make a much more detailed version of that in representation number 1. Okay. And I think that was our last question, and we are right at time. So I appreciate everyone joining us today. Hopefully today was helpful. The focus of this series is really to, reduce, some of the complexity with diagramming, because I mean, sometimes one of the most challenging things is I've got just a blank canvas. That's very intimidating. How do I get started? And that's the nice thing about, all of these different views and perspectives, because I can be very detailed when I need to be, or I can just consolidate that down and I can only focus on, what's my net change. Or if I want to go even further, I can, very, very limit that. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to approach this. So hopefully this has been helpful, and hopefully you guys will join us. I know our next session is going to be around representation of APIs inside of IriusRisk and how we can diagram those, and then a couple different concepts and ideas. So again, hopefully today was helpful. Appreciate everyone who was able to join, and thank you for the great questions. Have a great day. Bye, guys.